At the mouth of the Piscataqua River, where the water opens and the Atlantic begins, the air carries salt in every season. On Great Island, the wind comes off the open water with nothing to slow it. No hills, no dense interior forest, only the low coastal ground and the timber and stone of the small settlement gathered there. In early summer, the light on the river is gray-blue in the morning and catches copper in the afternoon, and the sound of the water is present everywhere on the island, beneath every other sound, a low continuous note that the people who lived there in 1682 would have stopped hearing the way a person stops hearing their own breathing. Great Island sits at the end of a narrow peninsula forming the southern boundary of the Piscataqua's mouth, a position that placed it in the path of weather coming in from the open ocean and made it one of the most exposed pieces of inhabited ground in the province of New Hampshire. The settlement there was not large. It was a working place, a fishing community, a trading point, a location where vessels coming in from the Atlantic could find a landing, and where timber from the interior of the province could be loaded for the voyage south or across to England. The island had the particular quality of a place that exists at the edge of things. The ocean was not a backdrop there, it was a presence, visible from almost every point on the settled ground, audible at every hour. A traveler arriving at Great Island in the spring of 1682 would have come by water, most likely by small boat along the river from Portsmouth, the provincial capital, sitting just a few miles upstream on the New Hampshire side. The crossing was brief but distinctive. The river at that point is wide enough that the far shore sits at a comfortable distance, and the island, low against the horizon, presents a view of rooftops and outbuildings, and cleared ground before any individual structure can be made out with clarity. What resolved first, coming in from the river, was the general shape of the settlement, compact, deliberate, a community that had organized itself around the practical requirements of coastal life rather than any grander plan. Among the structures visible from the water was a property that functioned, in the manner of its time, as both a residence and a public house. The man who maintained it was named George Walton. He was a landholder and an innkeeper, a man of modest but real local authority, the kind of authority that comes not from title or office, but from owning a piece of useful ground in a small community and being willing to open the door when travelers arrived. His property on Great Island served as an ordinary, which, in the usage of the period, meant a tavern or public house, where meals and drink were available at a set rate, a place travelers could stop, and where locals gathered. The ordinary was not a grand establishment. It was a working property of the kind a colonial New Hampshire innkeeper would have maintained. Timber framing, outbuildings, a cleared yard, space for animals, a gate to the road. The gate was a visible and practical feature of the Walton compound, the point where the property opened to the lane, and where a visitor would first announce themselves. Behind it, the yard held the various working structures that a property like Walton's required: a barn or stable for animals, storage for goods, fencing that marked out the boundary of the land Walton claimed and worked. The compound had the accumulated practical quality of a place that had been built and added to over years, each addition serving a specific need, the whole forming something more organic than architectural. In the gray light of a coastal morning, with the sound of the river present at the edges of everything, it would have looked like exactly what it was: a small but serious household at the end of the inhabited world, maintaining itself at the margin of the Atlantic. George Walton's position in the community was not uncomplicated. He held land and operated a public house, both of which placed him in the middle register of Great Island society, neither the most prominent man on the island nor an obscure one. But landowning in small colonial settlements was rarely a simple affair, and Walton's claim to his property on Great Island was not without contest. He was in active dispute with at least one neighbor over the boundaries of his land, a conflict that had the particular persistence of property disagreements in communities where the original surveys were imprecise. The documentation was thin, and the stakes were immediate and personal. In a settlement of a few hundred people, a land dispute was not a private matter. It was a shared piece of communal knowledge, something the whole settlement carried awareness of, in the way small communities carry awareness of everything that touches everyone's immediate interests. The neighbor at the center of that dispute was a woman named Hannah Jones. She was older than Walton, a property holder in her own right, a figure of the kind of standing that comes from long residence in a small place. The specific nature of the contested ground, which parcel, what boundary, by what prior claim, was a matter the community understood in its broad outline, even if the legal details were not universally known. What was universally known was that Walton and Jones disagreed about a piece of land and had disagreed about it for some time, and that the disagreement had not been resolved. In the tight lanes of Great Island, that kind of unresolved conflict between neighbors occupied a permanent position in the background of daily life. People knew about it. People had opinions about it. It was the kind of thing that came up when the relevant parties' names were mentioned, a piece of shared context that the settlement carried without needing to discuss it. The province of New Hampshire, within which Great Island and its inhabitants existed in 1682, was a remarkably new political entity. It had been formally constituted as a royal province only in 1679, just 3 years before the summer at the center of this account. Prior to that, the territory had existed in a condition of administrative ambiguity, partly claimed by and partly absorbed into Massachusetts Bay Colony, its governance a matter of ongoing contest between local interests and the larger colonial authority to the south. The 1679 establishment of New Hampshire as a separate royal province gave it, for the first time, its own institutional structure, a royal president and council, rather than the locally elected assembly that Massachusetts operated. But 3 years was not long enough to make that structure feel settled or authoritative to everyone within it. And so a province 3 years old is still working out what it is. The courts are new. The precedents are sparse. The officials are still finding the practical shape of their authority in a context where the social and legal habits inherited from Massachusetts Bay Colony competed with the new provincial charter's requirements. In New Hampshire in 1682, the relationship between the province's new administrative identity and the older habits of community governance was still being negotiated in ways that the residents of Great Island would have felt without necessarily being able to articulate. What they knew was that the authority over their disputes and their daily lives came from a small council in Portsmouth, a body that had existed for 3 years and was still earning whatever credibility it would eventually hold. Among the men who sat on that provincial council and carried administrative responsibility for the new province was a man who would ultimately leave the most detailed surviving record of the events at the Walton property in the summer of 1682. His name was Richard Chamberlain, and he served as Secretary of the Province of New Hampshire, a position that placed him at the center of the province's administrative life, responsible for its records and its correspondence and its institutional memory. Chamberlain was English-born, a secular official rather than a clergyman or a minister, a man whose professional training was in administration and documentation rather than in theology or doctrine. He was accustomed to writing things down, to treating events as matters of record, to producing accounts that could be consulted later. It is worth holding that identity in mind when thinking about the account Chamberlain eventually produced. A royal provincial secretary, sitting in Portsmouth in 1682, occupied a very particular kind of intellectual and institutional position. His job was to know what was happening in the province, to maintain the administrative record, and to deal with the practical business of governance on behalf of a royal council. He was not a man whose professional frame of reference inclined him toward the supernatural as a first explanation for unusual events. He was not a minister looking for providential meaning in disturbance. He was, professionally speaking, a man who wrote down what he observed and what witnesses reported and what the administrative record required, and who was skeptical in the manner of a person trained to be skeptical by the habits of bureaucratic work. Chamberlain's connection to the events at the Walton property in 1682 appears to have been personal as well as institutional. The provincial capital at Portsmouth was close enough to Great Island that a man of Chamberlain's standing could have had occasion to be at the Walton ordinary, as a lodger, as a visitor, as a traveler passing through, and the account he eventually produced suggests a first-hand familiarity with the property and the people that went beyond what institutional duty alone would have brought him there. The precise nature of his connection to the Walton household in the summer of 1682 is not fully documented, but the quality of detail in his eventual account points towards someone who had spent time on the property, rather than someone reconstructing events from second-hand reports alone. Standing at his writing desk in Portsmouth in 1682, surrounded by the administrative papers of the new province, land grants, council minutes, correspondence with London, the ongoing bureaucratic life of a 3-year-old colonial government, Chamberlain would have been a man used to the texture of documented fact. The papers to one side of his desk represented what the province officially knew about itself. What happened at the Walton property that summer would eventually become a different kind of document, not an administrative record, but a pamphlet produced years later, carrying the weight of memory and observation and interpretation all pressed together in a form designed to persuade as much as to record. The mouth of the Piscataqua River in early summer, before any disturbance at the Walton property, before any of the events that would eventually make Great Island notable in the colonial record, was a working stretch of water. Fishing vessels moved through it. Timber-laden boats made their way upstream and down. The river was wide and navigable at that point, its current strong enough that experienced pilots were essential for vessels moving through in uncertain weather, and the sight of boats on the water would have been a constant presence in the visual life of anyone on Great Island looking in that direction. The river connected the island to Portsmouth and to the wider province. The open ocean beyond connected it to England, to the Atlantic trade routes, to the broader world of which this small settlement was a distant and modest part. Great Island in 1682 was not isolated in the modern sense of the word. Isolated would have implied a separation from the world that the Piscataqua's regular traffic did not allow, but it was small and contained, and its population was close to one another in the way that populations of a few hundred people on a tidal island are inevitably close, not always warmly, not always without conflict, but close in the sense of shared knowledge, shared lanes, shared awareness of each other's business, and names and grievances. When something happened on Great Island, the people of Great Island knew about it, not all at once, and not always accurately, but quickly enough that the passage of news through the settlement was a matter of hours rather than days. The settlement itself, as it existed in 1682, was organized along the practical lines that coastal colonial communities typically followed. lanes rather than planned streets, buildings set in relation to the water and the working requirements of the place, rather than according to any formal civic design. The Walton property sat within this arrangement, its gate opening onto the lane, its outbuildings and yard visible to passers-by, its ordinary a place where the social life of the community had reason to concentrate. In a settlement without a great deal of formal public space, a tavern or ordinary served as one of the nodes around which community life organized itself, a place where people who had business with one another could expect to find one another, where news moved, where disputes were aired and sometimes deepened. George Walton, as the man who maintained that node, would have been known to nearly every person in the settlement in the particular way that innkeepers are known, not necessarily liked or admired, but recognized, associated with a place, part of the fabric of the settlement's daily operation. His land dispute with Hannah Jones would have been, in that context, a piece of information that anyone who used his ordinary and anyone who passed his property had absorbed without particularly intending to. It was simply part of the background knowledge of living in that community, one of the ongoing facts of life on Great Island that everybody carried without thinking much about it. The disputed boundary between the Walton and Jones properties was in physical terms probably not very dramatic. A fence line perhaps, a ditch, a surveyed marker that one party disputed. The kind of specific small geographical fact that can generate years of legal and personal conflict precisely because it is so specific, so physical, so continuously present. In a community where land was the primary measure of a family's security and standing, a disputed boundary was not a trivial matter, regardless of how prosaic its physical expression might appear to an outside observer. The piece of ground in question represented something real to both parties, something worth fighting for through whatever channels the new province's courts and the older habits of community pressure made available. The lanes of Great Island were narrow enough that George Walton and Hannah Jones would have passed each other on ordinary days, on the way to the river, on the way to whatever commerce or social obligation drew them out from their respective properties, in a proximity that unresolved conflict makes uncomfortable but does not prevent. Small communities do not offer the luxury of avoidance. The people within them move through the same spaces, use the same water, hear the same sounds from the same distance. Whatever lay between Walton and Jones in the spring of 1682 would have been present at those encounters, carried in whatever degree of formality or cold civility had come to govern how two neighbors in dispute treated each other in a place where they could not simply cease to occupy the same world. New Hampshire's administrative separation from Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1679 had not in 3 years done much to alter the social and religious texture of life in communities like Great Island. The habits of thought, the community frameworks, the inherited assumptions about how the world worked, and what forces might be at play in its disturbances, these were still largely the habits of New England Puritan life, carried from the Massachusetts context that had shaped this region for half a century. The theological and social understanding of unusual events, of disturbances that had no obvious natural explanation, of conflict between neighbors that extended beyond the civil into something harder to name. All of that had been formed in Massachusetts and persisted in New Hampshire, regardless of the new administrative boundary that the 1679 charter had drawn. What this meant, practically, was that the people of Great Island in 1682 inhabited a world in which the line between natural and unnatural disturbance was a live question with genuine theological stakes, not merely a puzzle for secular investigation. The Atlantic coast was a place where weather was unpredictable and sometimes violent, where ships were lost and people died in ways that felt random and punishing, and the community's way of making sense of inexplicable events drew on a tradition that took seriously the possibility that forces beyond the natural world could act on the human one. This was not a superstitious backwater. It was the mainstream of New England thought, the framework within which educated ministers and ordinary householders alike interpreted events that resisted simpler explanation. In that context, the position of Great Island, so exposed to open weather, so continuously subject to the sounds and movements of wind and water, meant that distinguishing between natural disturbance and something else was already a live and practiced kind of attention in the community. The wind came off the Atlantic with enough force in certain seasons to move things, to rattle structures, to produce sounds that a person inside a timber-framed building might not immediately locate or explain. The water of the Piscataqua was subject to currents and tidal movements that affected the island in ways visible and audible from the settled ground. Living at that edge of things required a kind of continuous environmental attentiveness that made people on Great Island perhaps more practiced than inland communities in noticing when something sounded wrong, and more practiced, too, in debating whether what sounded wrong had a natural cause or something else behind it. George Walton's ordinary in that environment was a building that had probably stood through several seasons of Atlantic weather by the spring of 1682. Its timber framing would have shown the particular quality of coastal construction, solid against what the weather required, functional without ornament, the windows small, and the walls thick enough to cut the sound of the wind without eliminating it entirely. The low, warm light from those windows in the evening, falling out toward the river, was the ordinary visible marker of habitation on that stretch of coast, the sign that the building was occupied, that someone was inside, that the place was operating. The sound of the water was always there at the edges. The salt in the air was always there. The wind came and went according to the season and the day, and the community on Great Island had long since learned to read its variations the way people learn to read anything they live with continuously. The year that preceded the summer of 1682 had been, by the surviving provincial record, an ordinary one for the young province of New Hampshire, the ordinary of a small colonial government, working out its procedures, managing its land claims, maintaining its relationship with the royal authority in London, and governing a population scattered along the Piscataqua and its tributaries in communities whose combined size amounted to something in the low thousands. Portsmouth, as the provincial capital, was the administrative center of this modest domain, and its council, of which Chamberlain was a functioning member, dealt with the practical business of colonial governance in a place still finding its institutional footing. Great Island was part of that domain, connected to Portsmouth by the river and by the shared administrative life of the province, but distinct in the way that a working coastal settlement is distinct from a capital, more focused on the immediate material requirements of fishing and trade and local commerce, less concerned with the administrative questions that occupied men like Chamberlain in their official capacity. The ordinary that Walton kept was part of that commercial fabric, a place where the practical social life of the island concentrated, and where a traveler from Portsmouth might stop in the course of business on the river. Richard Chamberlain, moving between Portsmouth and the river communities in his administrative capacity, would have been the kind of traveler who had occasion to stop at a place like the Walton Ordinary. The provincial secretary's work was not purely desk work. It involved moving through the province, attending to the business of governance in its various locations, meeting with the people whose affairs the council was responsible for managing. A man in that role, in a province of that size, would have been known by name and office in most of the settled communities along the Piscataway, and a man accustomed to moving through those communities, stopping at their ordinaries, observing the texture of life in them, would have been someone who noticed the social landscape, who the prominent people were, what conflicts were active, what the community was paying attention to. The land dispute between George Walton and Hannah Jones was, in that sense, the kind of thing that a man like Chamberlain might have been aware of before any larger event brought it to his attention as a matter of record. The provincial council had some jurisdiction over land disputes. The courts it was establishing were the venue through which such conflicts were supposed to be resolved, and an active dispute between two property holders on Great Island was not beyond the normal field of awareness of a provincial secretary, attentive to what was happening in the communities. The council served. All of this, the Walton property, the river at its mouth, the small and enclosed community on its low coastal island, the active dispute over a piece of land, the provincial secretary moving through the administrative life of a young and still forming province, constituted the ordinary world of Great Island in the spring and early summer of 1682. Nothing about it, taken in isolation, would have suggested that the community was about to experience something that would eventually be documented, published in London, and carried into the historical record of colonial America. It was simply the particular texture of life in a small New Hampshire settlement at that moment, modest, specific, real, the kind of place whose full weight as a human world is felt most clearly when the details are allowed to accumulate without hurry. The water moved past the island in the way it had always moved. The river was wide and gray-blue in the morning and caught color in the afternoon. The Walton Ordinary sat with its gate to the lane and its windows toward the Piscataway. The outbuildings and fencing of the compound were visible in the gray coastal light, the timber and stone of a modest working property maintained with the practical care that such properties required. George Walton was the man who maintained it, a landholder and innkeeper of the kind of authority that small communities produce, known, associated with a place, entangled in the ongoing conflicts of a settlement, close enough to itself that no dispute remained private for long. Hannah Jones lived nearby. The disputed ground between them was somewhere in the island's settled land, a boundary, a fence line, a surveyed edge that one party claimed and the other contested. The community knew about it. The community had, in the way of small communities, already formed its opinions about who was right and who was wrong, opinions that did not necessarily align with what the courts, new as they were, might eventually determine. In the lanes that crossed between the two properties, on the path to the river and back, the two households passed each other in the proximity that small communities do not allow anyone to escape. A few hundred people on a tidal island at the mouth of the Piscataway River. That was the scale of the world at Great Island in 1682, close enough that everyone knew the names of the parties in every dispute, familiar enough that news moved through the settlement like sound through still air, contained enough that nothing that happened in one part of the community failed to eventually reach the other parts. The lanes were narrow, the properties were close together. The ordinary where George Walton kept his public house was a place where the community's daily life came and went, where the texture of local conflict and local relationship was continuously renewed. When the stones began to fall that summer, everyone in the settlement already knew whose property they were falling on, and everyone already knew the name of the neighbor with whom that property's owner was in dispute, and everyone had already formed a view, shaped by proximity and loyalty and the particular angles of knowledge that small communities produce, about what the conflict between them meant and what kind of person each of them was. The stones had not yet fallen. The June evening had not yet arrived. The gate still stood undisturbed, and the windows of the ordinary still gave out their low warm light toward the river, and the sound of the water was present at every edge of the island, in the way it was always present, continuous, indifferent, the particular voice of that place where the Piscataqua opens and the Atlantic begins. On the night of June 11th, 1682, something began striking the Walton property on Great Island that no one standing on the grounds could account for. Stones arrived against the house. They struck the gate at the edge of the compound, the fencing, the outbuildings. They came from more than one direction at the same time, which is the specific detail Richard Chamberlain recorded first in his account of that night. Not the stones themselves, not the noise they made against the timber, but the fact that they arrived from multiple directions simultaneously, which meant that a single human agent, throwing from a single position in the dark, could not have produced what was being experienced. The windows took some of the impact.
The gate took more.
And then the night continued for a considerable while longer, the stones continuing to arrive, the household unable to identify a source. Chamberlain's account in Lithobolia is where the documented record of that night lives. He was present at the Walton property, or came to be present shortly after the initial outbreak, close enough to the events to record them with the precision of a man who understood that precision was what would matter later, that the value of his account would rest on its specificity, on the particularity of what he wrote down, rather than on the force of his conviction that something strange had occurred. He was a secretary to the provincial council. He had spent his working life producing documents that needed to hold up. The habit of exactness carried into what he wrote about Great Island. What he recorded about June 11th was this: the barrage was sudden, it was sustained. The stones struck the house and its immediate surroundings from multiple angles, which ruled out a single source. The windows were broken. The gate was struck. The disturbance did not simply stop after a few minutes and leave the household in an exhausted quiet. It continued long enough into the night that the people inside the house had time to move from confusion into something more prolonged, a state of waiting and listening that is its own kind of experience, different from the initial shock of the first impact. The property itself mattered to what happened. The Walton compound on Great Island was a working establishment, a tavern or ordinary, outbuildings, fencing, livestock pens, the infrastructure of a household that also served travelers moving along the Piscataqua. There was a perimeter to the property, a defined edge where the fencing marked the boundary between the Walton ground and what lay beyond it, and the gate in that fencing became, on the night of June 11th, the most persistently struck object on the property. It received the stones again and again, not once and then other things, but repeatedly, as if the gate were the point the disturbance was most interested in addressing. Chamberlain documented the fact of the gate specifically. He noted it as a repeated focus of attack on that first night, and in the weeks and months that followed, returned to, struck, damaged in its accumulated way, the timber showing what repeated impact over time produces in material that is not designed to receive it. A gate is a threshold. It is the marked edge between the private interior of a property and whatever lies outside it. Whether that significance is meaningful to the interpretation of what happened on Great Island, or simply a descriptive fact about where most of the stones happened to land, is one of those questions the record raises without settling. The first night was not the last night. This is what distinguishes the Walton episode in the colonial record of similar disturbances, not the severity of any single incident, but the duration of the phenomenon as a whole. The stone throwing did not resolve itself in one dramatic outbreak and then cease. It returned. It returned over a period of several months, arriving with varying intensity across that span, sometimes nightly, sometimes with intervals of quiet that were long enough to suggest the disturbances had ended, and then followed by a new incident that confirmed they had not. The household moved through this period, George Walton and his family, the lodgers and servants who lived or worked on the property, the neighbors and visitors who came to the house and sometimes witnessed incidents themselves, in a state that Chamberlain's account renders as something between vigilance and a kind of grim accommodation. The strange thing having become, over weeks and months, a recurring feature of life in that specific place. The stones themselves are worth dwelling on because Chamberlain dwelt on them. He was not simply noting that stones were thrown. He was recording their characteristics, their size, their weight, their behavior relative to the apparent force and distance of their arrival. Some of the stones he described as unusually large or heavy given the trajectories they appeared to have followed. A stone that arrives with significant force through a window or against a gate has come from somewhere, and the somewhere has to account for the momentum the stone carries. The stones landing on the Walton property, in Chamberlain's account, sometimes did not seem entirely consistent with the trajectories and distances that would have produced them if a human being with ordinary throwing ability had been responsible. He did not make this claim dramatically. He recorded it as an observation. Here is what arrived. Here is what the weight and speed suggest. Here is where that does and does not correspond to what a person standing at the property's edge could have produced. The windows bore the record of the first night most visibly. Glass in the colonial period was not easily or cheaply replaced, and broken windows in a tavern were a practical problem as well as a physical marker of what had occurred. The house with its broken windows in the morning after the first outbreak stood as a document of the previous night's events, visible to anyone who approached the property. Not a matter of testimony that could be questioned or a report that could be doubted, but a physical fact. The fractured glass sitting in the frames and on the floor below, the cold harbor air moving through the openings where the panes had been. Chamberlain went outside. During active episodes of stone throwing, he went out of the house and searched the property and the ground beyond the fencing. He held a lantern and looked. He was attempting what a man with a practical and administrative cast of mind attempts when confronted with a phenomenon he does not understand. He looked for the mechanism. He looked for the human being who was doing this. He searched the area the stones appeared to be coming from, the edges of the property, the ground outside the gate. He recorded finding nothing he could identify as the source. This was not a single search on a single occasion. Across the months of the disturbance, he made this kind of examination more than once, and each time the account in Lithobolia returns to the same conclusion. Nothing was found that explained it. The objects moved, too. The stone throwing was the most consistent and documented form the disturbances took, but Chamberlain's account extends to the movement of household objects within the property. Tools were displaced. Fencing was damaged or moved. Objects inside the house were found in positions inconsistent with where they had been left. The nature of this displacement was not always violent. It was not always the sharp impact of a stone against a wall or a gate, but rather the quieter kind of disturbance that is in some ways harder to document because the evidence is an absence, a thing not where it should be, a position that requires someone to say with confidence that it was different yesterday, and that no one they know of moved it in the intervening time. The gate was struck again and again across the months of the disturbance, not only on June 11th, not only in the first days of the episode, but across the sustained duration of the events through that summer and into the following months. The accumulation of damage was visible. The repeated return to the same point in the property's perimeter, the marked edge, the threshold between inside and out, is one of the consistent features of the Walton case that runs through Chamberlain's account from the first night to the later incidents. Something kept coming back to the gate. In the weeks that followed the initial outbreak, the household developed routines around the disturbances. People moved through the property with the awareness that something might arrive without warning, that the quiet of a given afternoon or evening was not a guarantee of the quiet of the hour that followed. The lodgers and guests who came and went from the tavern became witnesses in their own right, people who had heard about what was happening at the Walton property and then found themselves present during an incident, standing in a yard where stones were arriving from directions no one could identify, in the company of a household that had by then had weeks to become familiar with this experience and still had no explanation for it. The livestock on the property were disturbed during the course of the events. Chamberlain's account records animals unsettled during incidents of stone throwing, and some reports indicate injury to animals on the property over the course of the disturbances. The compound was a working agricultural and domestic establishment. There would have been horses, perhaps cattle, certainly chickens or geese, the ordinary livestock of an innkeeper's property, and the disturbances reached them too, extended beyond the house and the gate, and the windows into the animals kept in the pens and outbuildings at the edges of the compound. An animal cannot offer testimony. An animal that is injured or visibly disturbed in the morning after a night of disturbance is simply a fact on the ground, and the fact stands independently of any account given by a human witness. The marked stones are where Chamberlain's account becomes most precisely evidentiary, most specifically the record of a man trying to think carefully about what was in front of him. During the course of the disturbances, stones from the barrages were collected and marked. A scratch, a chalk mark, some identifying indication placed on the surface of the stone so that it could be recognized again if it appeared later. This was not a sophisticated scientific protocol. It was a practical attempt to establish whether the stones that arrived were new stones each time, drawn from the ground of the island, from the beach, from the surrounding coastal terrain, or whether something more unusual was occurring, something that involved the return of the same stones, the same specific objects, cycle after cycle. What Chamberlain recorded was that some of the marked stones reappeared. A stone set aside after one barrage, its surface carrying the mark placed on it by a witness, was found again in the yard or the compound during or after a subsequent incident. This is the detail that he recorded most carefully, that he returned to in his account with the evident sense that it was the kind of specific, testable observation that mattered, the kind of thing that was harder to dismiss than a general report of stones falling from nowhere. A marked stone that appears again is a specific object with a specific history. It was here, it was set aside, it was somewhere else, and now it is here again. The question of where it was in the interval and how it came to return is the question the marked stone raises without answering. There were mornings when the yard of the Walton property lay scattered with stones that no one had watched arrive. The night had been a night of disturbance. The stones had fallen through the dark hours, and then the morning came gray and coastal and salt-smelling off the Piscataqua, and the yard held the evidence of what the dark had produced. The stones lay on the damp ground in the early light, each one a physical object with weight and surface, and the evidence of impact somewhere on its face, the scuff where it had struck the gate, or the timber of the outbuilding wall, or the fencing that ran along the edge of the compound. The household went out into those mornings and moved through the yard. They walked among the scattered stones. They looked at the damage to the gate, the fencing, the outbuildings. They looked at the animals in the pens, assessing their state. They collected the stones that had fallen overnight, and sometimes they marked them, and then they set them aside in a row on a shelf or a ledge inside the house, the evidentiary measure of practical people confronted with a situation that practical measures did not resolve. Chamberlain, when he searched the property during incidents, was making the same kind of effort, the effort to account for something through the methods available to a person of his time and training, which meant looking with his eyes, searching with a lantern, examining the ground for the evidence of a human presence, a footprint in the soft coastal earth, a place in the fencing disturbed by someone climbing through, any physical indicator that the source of the stones was a person standing outside the property and throwing into it. He found none of those things. The ground around the property, when he searched it, did not offer him what he was looking for. The fencing was not disturbed at the points the stones appeared to be coming from. The soft ground held no clear evidence of a person standing where a person would have needed to stand to produce what the household was experiencing. The duration of the episode across several months meant that the Walton household was not dealing with an isolated night of fear and confusion that could be set aside in memory as one terrible event and eventually placed at a useful distance. The disturbances were a recurring fact of life on the property through that summer. The gate was struck again. The windows, if they had been repaired, were at risk again. The mornings arrived with their scatterings of stones on the ground, the yard holding its record of the night before, and then the work of the tavern and the household continued through the day, in the awareness that the night might produce the same thing again. George Walton is the figure around whom the entire episode centered, and yet Chamberlain's account, attentive as it is to the documented events, does not render him in great psychological detail. He is a man operating a property under siege, a householder confronted with a disturbance he could not stop and could not explain, a man in a dispute with his neighbor that had now taken on an entirely new dimension in the eyes of his community. He continued to live and work on the property. The tavern continued to function. The episode did not drive him out of the house, did not end his occupancy of the great island compound, though what it cost him across those months, in practical and reputational terms, is a calculation the record does not fully permit. The disturbances extended in their variety beyond the throwing of stones. Chamberlain documented incidents in which objects within the house were moved or displaced, not with the force of the stones against the gate or the windows, but moved nonetheless, found in positions that the household could not account for by any ordinary means. A tool left in one place, found in another. A piece of furniture or household equipment displaced from its position without any witness to the displacement. These incidents are harder to document than the stone throwing precisely because they leave less physical evidence of the kind that can be independently confirmed. A displaced object is only evidence of displacement if you can establish with confidence what its position was before, and that kind of confidence rests on the testimony of the people who were present, which is the same testimony that records everything else in the case. The gate returned again and again in Chamberlain's account as the primary focus of the physical disturbances. There is something worth noting in that specificity, not an interpretation, but a fact in the record, that across months of documented disturbance, the gate at the edge of the Walton compound was the single most persistently targeted point on the property. It was struck on June 11th. It was struck in subsequent incidents. Its timber accumulated the damage of repeated impacts across weeks and months, and Chamberlain recorded this accumulation not as a dramatic detail, but as a plain fact about what had happened to a specific object on the property of a specific household over a specific period of time. The sounds of the stones arriving were part of what the household lived with across those months. The sound of a stone striking timber is a particular sound, sharp, immediate, with a resonance that continues briefly after the impact, the wood vibrating at the point of contact. The sound of a stone breaking a window is different, the initial strike followed by the fall and scatter of the glass, the sound of small fragments settling on the floor or on the ground outside. These sounds arrived in the night, arrived at the gate in the dark, arrived against the outbuilding walls and the fencing, and the household inside heard them and knew what they were because they had heard them before. Because by the second week and the third week and the weeks after that, the sound of a stone striking the gate was recognizable, was a sound that had acquired a history on this specific property. What no one in the household or among the witnesses who came to the property during incidents was able to produce was a moment of direct observation in which the source of the stones was identified. Chamberlain searched during active incidents and found nothing. Witnesses standing in the yard during barrages, watching the direction from which the stones appeared to come, could not identify a figure standing at the property's edge and throwing. The stones arrived, and their arrival was witnessed, and their landing was witnessed, and the trajectories they appeared to have followed were observed and recorded. But the point of origin, the hand, the person, the mechanism, was never identified in the moment of a disturbance by anyone whose account made it into the documentary record. This is what the Walton case leaves in the historical record: a property on Great Island, a gate struck again and again across several months, a household living through a sustained and documented disturbance, and a provincial administrator who went outside with a lantern during active incidents and searched the surrounding ground and came back in with nothing he could name as an explanation. The record is specific. It is more specific than many accounts of similar episodes from this period. The specificity is what makes it hold, not because specificity guarantees truth, but because specificity is the form that honest documentation takes when a careful person is trying to record something they cannot explain. The mornings after the worst nights were quiet. The coastal gray of early summer along the Piscataqua, the light coming up over the water, the salt smell of the harbor, the sound of the river moving, held no residue of the previous night's disturbance beyond what the physical evidence on the ground documented. The stones lay in the yard, the damaged fencing and the marked gate stood at the edge of the compound. The animals in their pens moved through the morning in their ordinary animal way, whatever disturbance of the previous night having passed into a new day that looked like every other day on Great Island. Somewhere in the house, on a shelf or a window ledge or a surface that a careful household would have chosen for the purpose, a row of marked stones sat record. They had been gathered from the yard during one incident or several, their surfaces scratched or chalked with the marks that witnesses had placed on them so that they could be recognized later. They were stones from Great Island, from the beach or the ground of the Piscataqua shore, ordinary stones, coastal stones, the kind of stone that lies in great quantities along the waterline of any tidal island in the harbor, marked to distinguish them, set aside, held as evidence. And then, one of them appeared again in the yard, not the yard after a morning of ordinary coastal weather. The yard after a night of disturbance, when the household had again heard the stones arriving against the gate and the walls, had again waited through the dark for the barrage to stop, had again gone out into the gray early light to find the ground scattered with what the night had produced. Among those stones, on at least one occasion that Chamberlain documented, with the directness of a man recording a specific and testable observation, was a stone that carried the mark placed on it days or weeks before, a stone that had been gathered, identified, set aside, and was now back in the yard among the other stones, lying on the damp ground in the early summer morning light, its surface carrying both the mark of the witness who had tried to account for it and the evidence of another impact against something solid in the dark. The mark was still on it. The stone was recognizable. It had been somewhere else, and now it had returned, where it had been in the intervening time, and how it came back to the compound of the Walton property on Great Island, and what the mechanism was that produced its return, is a question Chamberlain recorded and could not answer. The stone simply lay there in the morning, specific and quiet, and entirely ordinary in every respect, except the one that mattered, which was that it had been here before, had been set aside, and was here again. That was what the record held, and what it continued to hold across the months of the disturbance on Great Island. Not an explanation, but a series of specific, documented physical facts, accumulated in a yard at the mouth of the Piscataqua, lying on the ground with the patient weight of things that have simply arrived and have not yet been accounted for. Richard Chamberlain was not a minister. That fact matters, and it is the first thing worth holding clearly before anything else in his account is considered. In the summer of 1682, when the stones began to fall on the Walton property at Great Island, Chamberlain was serving as Secretary of the Province of New Hampshire, an administrative post, a secular one, the kind of position filled by a man trained to keep records and assess evidence rather than to interpret scripture or manage the spiritual welfare of a congregation. He was an English-born colonial official, appointed to his role in the new province's council, accustomed to the procedures of civil governance rather than the rhetoric of the pulpit. When he turned his attention to the events at the Walton household, he did so as a man whose professional habit was documentation. That is not a small thing. The literature of colonial supernatural disturbance in New England was dominated, in this period, by ministers. Increase Mather wrote, Cotton Mather wrote. The clergy produced the records that survived, shaped the framework through which disturbances were understood, and brought to every account the weight of theological interpretation. Chamberlain brought something different. He brought the habits of an administrator, a man who noted what he saw, who recorded what witnesses told him, who attempted, within the limits of the tools available to him, to test what he was observing before he committed it to paper. The result is a document unlike most of what the period produced. He was present at the Walton property during at least some of the stone-throwing episodes. That presence is what gives Lithobolia its particular quality among the documents the case generated, not merely the fact that someone recorded the events, but that the person who recorded them had stood in the dark of a June night on Great Island and gone out onto the property while the stones were still arriving, looking for a human hand, finding none. He wrote about those searches with the straightforward particularity of a man describing a physical investigation. He went outside, he looked, he found no one. He returned inside and wrote down what he had found, which was nothing. The specificity of that approach, going out, searching, returning, writing, runs through Lithobolia in a way that distinguishes it from documents that were produced at a greater remove. Chamberlain was not reconstructing events from others' accounts alone. He was recording, in part, his own physical presence in an active and genuinely inexplicable situation, and the tone of that recording is something closer to the language of a field report than to the language of a sermon. He noted trajectories. He noted the dimensions and apparent weight of stones. He noted the directions from which projectiles arrived, and whether those directions admitted any obvious concealed position from which a human thrower could have operated. He noted above all the things that he looked for and did not find. One of the more careful things he recorded was his use of marked stones as a form of identification. The procedure was practical rather than ceremonial. Stones that landed in the yard or struck the house during an active incident were set aside by witnesses, marked in some identifying way, scratched or otherwise distinguished, so that they could be recognized if they appeared again. The purpose was to establish, with at least minimal evidentiary clarity, whether specific stones were returning in subsequent barrages, or whether the stones were simply numerous and new each time. What Chamberlain recorded was that marked stones did reappear. Objects that had been identified and set aside were found again, in later incidents, among the stones arriving in the yard. He noted this as a specific observational fact, not as a conclusion about its cause, and the precision with which he described the procedure gives the observation a quality that pure testimony alone would not have. He was trying to think clearly. He was trying to design within the practical limits of a June night in colonial New Hampshire, something that would tell him more than his bare senses could. Those marked stones sitting on a shelf or window ledge inside the Walton house, placed there deliberately, carried indoors, identified, are among the more quietly striking images the pamphlet contains. They represent a practical response to an inexplicable situation. The household could not explain what was happening. What it could do was observe more carefully. The stones were there, physical and real, with their marks still on them, and the fact that they had apparently returned was the kind of detail that did not resolve into a comfortable explanation, regardless of which direction one approached it from. Chamberlain's pamphlet was published in London in 1698. The full title ran at considerable length, as titles of the period often did. Lithobolia, or the stone-throwing devil, being an exact and true account of the strange and unaccountable actions of an evil spirit, or devil, at a house in Groton, in the province of New Hampshire in America. The title's confidence, exact, true, unaccountable, is itself a period artifact, the declarative certainty of a pamphlet that needed to establish its credibility against a reading public predisposed to skepticism about such accounts. The word lithobolia was Greek, meaning stone throwing, and its use as a title was both precise and slightly theatrical, the kind of learned reference that signaled an author who expected to be taken seriously by an educated readership. The pamphlet was printed in London, not in Boston or Portsmouth, and it entered a reading market that was, in 1698, living through its own complex aftermath of the Salem prosecutions of 1692. The gap between 1682 and 1698 is 16 years. This is one of the two primary factors historians cite when they think carefully about what lithobolia can and cannot tell us. 16 years is a long time between an event and its documentation. Chamberlain was working from memory, and whatever notes he may have made at the time, which have not survived separately, reconstructing the events of a summer more than a decade and a half in the past. Memory is not an archive. It selects, it shapes, it smooths the edges of what was genuinely confusing and sharpens the edges of what confirmed a conclusion. Whether Chamberlain worked from contemporaneous notes that no longer survive independently, or whether he was reconstructing from memory alone, is a question the surviving record cannot answer with certainty. What is clear is that the gap existed and that it matters when reading the account. The second factor is what was happening in English-speaking culture in 1698. The Salem witch trials had concluded 6 years before the pamphlet appeared. The discourse around supernatural agency, demonic action, and the reliability of testimony in witchcraft cases had been transformed, and not gently, by what had happened in Salem in 1692, and by the recantations, re-examinations, and communal grief that followed. Writing about supernatural disturbances in 1698 meant writing into a conversation that had recently been altered in fundamental ways. Readers who might have received such an account with simple credence in 1682 were, by 1698, bringing a great deal more to the reading than they would have brought before Salem. They were asking different questions. They were alert to different possibilities of error. Chamberlain's choice to publish when he did, 6 years after Salem, 16 years after the events, was itself a statement. The pamphlet was not a neutral record. It was an argument. Its subtitle committed to that. The account was exact, true, and the spirit was evil. Chamberlain wanted to be believed. He was writing to persuade a specific readership that what he had witnessed in the summer of 1682 was real, that it had been observed by credible people under conditions that made error or fraud difficult to explain, and that the events recorded in Lithobolia merited the reading public's serious attention. The document is simultaneously a record and a case being made, and the two purposes run through every paragraph without cleanly separating from each other. That does not make it dishonest. It makes it a pamphlet of its moment, shaped by the conventions and pressures of its form. The genre of credentialed supernatural testimony, the first-hand account by a named respectable witness, published in pamphlet form, and intended to establish the reality of a particular class of phenomena, was already a recognizable one in 1698. Chamberlain knew the genre. His approach borrowed from it and built on it. His administrative identity, his secular credentials, his insistence on first-hand observation, all of these were moves within a recognizable rhetoric of supernatural credibility aimed at a readership that had learned to distinguish, or at least to attempt to distinguish, between reliable and unreliable accounts of the extraordinary. Within the pamphlet, there is a passage that deserves particular attention. Chamberlain named the neighbor who was widely suspected in the community of having caused the disturbances, but he named her only as J, a single initial on a printed page. The gesture offered nominal discretion. The woman's full name did not appear in the published text, but it offered almost nothing in practice. Everyone in Newcastle would have read J as a specific name. The community was small enough, the land dispute well enough known, that any resident would have understood exactly who was meant the moment the initial appeared. The discretion was formal rather than real. It protected Chamberlain from having made a printed accusation, which carried its own legal risks, without protecting the woman herself from being identified by everyone who read the pamphlet in the province. The decision to obscure the name while making it transparent to local readers is a small and specific thing, but it is the kind of detail that tells something about the kind of document Lithobolia is. It was careful in the ways that a man with legal and institutional standing would be careful. It was also written with a local readership in mind, alongside the London one, or rather, the local readership was already part of the text, already reading through the formal gestures, already knowing what J meant. The initial sat on the page thin and discreet, and it was in the community that had witnessed the events, entirely transparent. The pamphlet as a physical object, small, printed on coarse paper in the typographic conventions of the late 17th century, its long title set in the formal style of the period, entered London's reading market in 1698, among other publications of the year, sitting in booksellers' stalls alongside other pamphlets of testimony and argument. Its audience was broad enough to include people who had never heard of New Hampshire and had no particular investment in whether the stone throwing at George Walton's property had been real. It also reached, almost certainly, people in New England who were reading it in the shadow of everything the region had been through in the preceding decade. The pamphlet carried different weight for different readers, and none of those readings were wrong exactly. They were simply different positions relative to the same text. What Chamberlain produced, in the end, was something genuinely unusual in the literature of colonial American supernatural experience. A secular account, by a named official, of events he had personally witnessed, with at least a rudimentary attempt at evidentiary method built into the reporting itself. The marked stones, the searches of the grounds during active incidents, the recording of trajectories and dimensions, the effort to identify what would count as evidence of something returning. These are not the gestures of a minister delivering a sermon about God's providential warnings to a sinning community. They are the gestures of a man who worked with documents and procedures, and who brought those habits to a situation that exceeded the explanatory capacity of everything he had professionally managed before. The limitations of the account are real and cannot be set aside. 16 years. The pressure of the Salem aftermath. The rhetorical purpose of the pamphlet. The one-sided perspective of a document produced by a man who was himself a party to the events he was recording, who was present in the Walton household, and whose account of what he saw was shaped by the position from which he saw it. These factors do not make Lithobolia worthless. They make it a historical document, which is a different category than a transparent window onto the past. Every historical document is shaped by the position of the person who produced it, the purposes for which they produced it, the moment in which they produced it, and the form they chose. Lithobolia is shaped by all of these things, and reading it carefully means reading those shapes as well as the content they contain. There is a particular quality to the detail Chamberlain included about going outside during active incidents and searching the property. He described the coastal dark of Great Island at night, the grounds of the Walton compound, the absence of any visible human source for the stones that were arriving. He held his lantern out against the darkness and looked. The image has stayed with the account across 3 centuries. The administrator from Portsmouth, the man accustomed to provincial papers and council proceedings, standing in the summer dark on the edge of the Piscataqua with stones arriving around him from directions he could not account for, looking for a cause and finding the dark continuing quietly in every direction he turned. He wrote that down. He found nothing, and he wrote down that he found nothing, with the same precision he brought to the things he did find. The nothing is as much a part of the record as the stones. Chamberlain's role as secretary of the province gave him access to the events that a private citizen without institutional standing would not have had. He was present at the Walton property, not as a curious bystander, but as a man whose position made his presence both appropriate and documented. His name, his title, and his proximity to the colonial administration of the new province were part of what gave his account its specific weight. When he recorded what happened at the Walton household, he did so as a man whose professional identity was built around the reliable documentation of proceedings, a man who in his ordinary work would have been held to account for errors in his record-keeping in ways that carried real institutional consequence. That professional context did not make his supernatural testimony infallible, but it placed his testimony within a frame of accountability that set it apart from much of the paranormal literature of the era. There is also the question of what Chamberlain chose not to record, or what did not survive the 16-year gap between the events and the writing. The pamphlet is the document that remains. Whatever notes or contemporaneous records may have existed are not separately accessible. The account as printed in 1698 is the account that history has, whether it was complete, whether it was shaped by memory in ways that favored certain details and softened others, whether the 16 years of distance altered the proportions of what Chamberlain recalled. These are questions the document itself cannot answer. The archive has what it has, and what it has is Lithobolia, with its marked stones, and its searches in the dark, and its single initial standing in for a name that everyone in Newcastle already knew. The pamphlet arrived in London in 1698, carrying the weight of a specific man's specific memory and the shadow of a decade of New England history that had transformed how readers on both sides of the Atlantic thought about supernatural accusations, evidentiary standards, and the question of how confident anyone could responsibly be about what they had seen in a dark yard with a lantern held against the night. It was read by people who were still working through Salem. It was read by people who had not thought much about New Hampshire and had no particular stake in whether the events it described had a human or an inhuman explanation. It was read by people who were inclined to believe it, and people who were inclined to be skeptical, and people who found it simply strange and set it aside. The marked stones by then had been sitting inside the Walton house for 16 years or more, or had long since been lost, incorporated back into the ordinary world of the compound, become again simply stones with no particular history. The lantern Chamberlain had held against the coastal dark was gone. The searches of the grounds were memory. What remained was the pamphlet, printed and distributed, its long, careful title declaring exactness and truth, its single initial sitting in the text where a name should have been, its account of a June night in 1682, still intact and still waiting for a reading that would resolve it. No such reading has arrived. The pamphlet is still there. The resolution is not. The window it opens onto the summer of 1682 at Great Island is a partial one, shaped by who held it, when they looked, and what they were trying to see. But partial windows are sometimes the most honest kind. Chamberlain did not claim to explain what had happened. He claimed to have witnessed it, to have searched for its source, and to have found nothing that satisfied him. He made an argument about the nature of the cause. The pamphlet's title left little doubt about where he came down on the question of agency, but he also preserved in the specific details of his searches and his evidentiary attempts the record of a man who had genuinely tried to think the situation through rather than accepting the first available explanation. That combination, argument and method, conviction and recorded uncertainty, is what makes Lithobolia an interesting document rather than simply a period artifact. It holds two things at once, and neither one entirely cancels the other. The man believed what he believed about what had happened at the Walton property in 1682. He also went outside in the dark and looked at the 1698 pamphlet, moved through its London readership, and then continued to exist in collections, in archive, in the shelves of institutions that preserved the printed record of the colonial period, until digitization eventually converted the original pages into something accessible to anyone with the curiosity and the means to find it. The text that Chamberlain produced 16 years after the stones fell is still readable today. His account of the searches in the dark, the marked stones, the initial where a name should have been, the coastal compound on Great Island at the mouth of the Piscataqua, all of it survives, a specific and partial record of a summer that left more questions than it answered. The pamphlet entered the London reading public in 1698, carrying both things at once, and in that layered arriving, one man's careful, interested, incomplete memory of an inexplicable series of events, landing in a readership, still living through the aftermath of what New England had done to itself in Salem 6 years before. The document found the most complicated possible audience, for the most complicated possible story, and left it, as it has left every audience since, without the resolution it arrived looking for. The question the pamphlet opened in 1698 is the same question it holds open today. What Chamberlain went looking for in the dark at Great Island, on those June nights when the stones were still arriving from directions he could not account for, he did not find. He wrote that down, and the document that contains that writing, small, coarse papered, its long title set in the formal type of the period, still sits in the archive, exactly as partial and exactly as unresolved as the night it was made to describe. The land itself came first. Before the stones, before the pamphlet, before the name that everyone in Newcastle read through the thin cover of a single printed initial, there was a piece of ground on Great Island, and two households who each believed it belonged to them. The dispute between George Walton and his neighbor Hannah Jones was rooted in something as ordinary and as consequential as a boundary line, a surveyed edge, a claimed right, a portion of cleared ground on a small tidal island at the mouth of the Piscataqua River that one party held by deed and the other by a grievance that had not quieted. These things were common in colonial New England. They were the texture of daily life in settlements where land was the primary form of wealth and the legal instruments for establishing its ownership were still new and not always precise. A dispute over property in a community of a few hundred people was not an abstraction. It was visible. It was a thing a person walked past every morning and thought about every evening, a thing that shaped which paths a household took, which faces they met in the lanes, and what expressions those faces carried. What happened between George Walton and Hannah Jones before the summer of 1682 was, in legal terms, a property conflict. The record does not preserve every detail of the original grievance. Colonial New Hampshire's administrative apparatus was barely 3 years old in 1682, and the documents that survived are not complete. But the broad shape of the dispute is documented. Walton had acquired or claimed land that Jones believed was rightfully hers, or her family's, or was owed to her in some form that the formal record had failed to honor. The specific parcel, the exact line of the boundary, the instrument by which Walton had come to hold it, these details exist at the edge of what the surviving record clearly establishes. What is established is the grievance itself, that it was real, that it was known to the community, and that it had not been resolved. There is something worth dwelling on in that unresolved quality. The legal and civic systems available to small colonial communities in 1682 were genuinely limited in their capacity to settle disputes of this kind cleanly. The province of New Hampshire's court system was new and working from inherited Massachusetts statutes in a jurisdiction that was still finding its administrative shape. Civil property cases could be filed, argued, and appealed, but the resolution of a boundary dispute in a community as small and as socially dense as Newcastle did not end with a verdict. It continued. The parties still lived within walking distance of each other. They still shared the same lanes, the same wharf, the same ordinary where neighbors gathered. A court decision might establish a legal fact about the land. It did not dissolve the feeling that remained between the households on either side of the line. Hannah Jones, as the historical record describes her, was an older woman, a neighbor with her own property, her own standing, and her own history in the community. The social position she occupied fits a pattern that scholars studying colonial New England have identified across dozens of cases from the period. The historian Carol Carlson, in her detailed examination of witchcraft accusation in New England, documented that the women most frequently accused of practicing harmful magic in this period tended to share certain characteristics. They were older, often widowed, or living without the protective social cover of a husband. sometimes property holding in ways that put them in conflict with male neighbors or heirs, and frequently figures around whom some portion of community resentment or unease had already gathered before any accusation was formally made. Hannah Jones fit this template closely enough that when the stones began to fall on the Walton property in June of 1682, the community already had a framework ready for understanding what was happening and a name that fit inside it. The historian John Demos, whose work on witchcraft in colonial New England traced the social and psychological dynamics of accusation across a wide range of cases, documented the same pattern from a different angle. What Demos found, working through the records of dozens of colonial witchcraft cases, was that the accusations rarely emerged from nowhere. They grew from prior conflict, from a specific and often long-standing tension between neighbors or within communities that had not been resolved through the available social and legal mechanisms. The accusation was not the beginning of the conflict. It was a transformation of a conflict that already existed into a new register, one where the emotional stakes were considerably higher and the community's capacity to respond was correspondingly more charged. The leap from property dispute to supernatural accusation was not, in the social logic of 1682 New England, as large as it might appear from a distance of 3.5 centuries. It was a shift in language. The same conflict moved from the civic and legal vocabulary of deeds and boundaries into the theological vocabulary of witchcraft and maleficent power, and that shift had consequences for everyone involved. Paul Boyer and Stephen Nissenbaum, in their influential study of the Salem witch trials, developed this framework in its most detailed form, that unresolved land disputes, inheritance conflicts, and economic tensions within small colonial communities served as the social kindling for witchcraft accusations, with the supernatural framing providing a language capable of expressing resentments and fears that the community's ordinary civic mechanisms could not adequately address. The Walton Jones case did not belong to Salem. It preceded those events by a decade, and it resolved quite differently, but it fit the pattern Boyer and Nissenbaum described with a precision that scholars of colonial witchcraft have consistently noted: a property dispute, an older contentious neighbor, an inexplicable physical phenomenon that the community was prepared to interpret within a theological framework, and a narrative that gave the aggrieved party a new and considerably more powerful position in the conflict than the civil courts had provided. Consider what the haunting offered George Walton, if it is held within the framework of ordinary human social dynamics rather than the supernatural. Before the stones began, Walton was a landholder and innkeeper in a small and ongoing dispute with a neighbor, a dispute that had the status of many such disputes in colonial New Hampshire, which is to say, it was real and contentious and not cleanly resolved. After the stones began, Walton was the victim of something the community was prepared to understand as diabolical. His adversary was no longer simply a difficult neighbor with a competing claim to a piece of ground. She was, in the community's reading of events, potentially a servant of a power that lay outside the boundary of what ordinary civic institutions could address. The land conflict had not changed, but the frame around it had changed entirely, and that change in framing carried real and immediate consequences in a community where the theological dimension of daily life was not metaphorical but structural. This does not mean the haunting was staged for social advantage. That claim goes beyond what the evidence establishes. It is simply worth noting, as the scholars who have examined this case most carefully have consistently noted, that the supernatural accusation did not float free of the specific human conflict that preceded it. The two were connected, not accidentally, but by a social logic that operated consistently across colonial New England, producing similar patterns in case after case from the same period. The accusation against Hannah Jones did not require anyone in Newcastle to be consciously manipulative or dishonest. The framework of providential theology in which the community lived made the interpretation of inexplicable physical phenomena as diabolical interference entirely natural, not a fabrication overlaid on a mundane event, but a genuine way of understanding the world that most people in 1682 New Hampshire shared without reservation. Richard Chamberlain, who documented the events in Lithobolia, was a secular administrative official rather than a minister, but his account reflected the same theological framework at its edges. His observations were precise, and his evidentiary instincts were careful. The marked stones, the attempts to search the property during active incidents, the systematic record of what was witnessed and by whom, but the interpretive background of his account was the same providential worldview in which an unexplained physical disturbance was naturally understood as having a spiritual cause. When he identified Hannah Jones by the initial J in his published pamphlet, he was not merely naming a suspect in a secular investigation. He was placing her within a theological category that carried specific and serious implications in the legal and social framework of his time. The legal dimension of what that accusation meant in 1682 New Hampshire is worth holding carefully. Witchcraft was a capital crime under English common law, and the statutes the province of New Hampshire had inherited from Massachusetts Bay Colony. An accusation of this kind was not a social inconvenience. It was, in principle, a charge that could end in execution. The evidentiary standards required for a conviction were demanding. The courts of the period, particularly in the years before Salem produced its catastrophic loosening of evidentiary norms, required more than spectral evidence and community testimony to convict, but the accusation itself carried weight. To be named, even by a single initial in a pamphlet, as the suspected cause of diabolical stone throwing in a small colonial community was to be placed in a position from which the paths of recovery were neither clear nor comfortable. What the historical record shows for Hannah Jones is not a criminal trial. It shows something considerably quieter. The legal activity surrounding the Walton-Jones dispute appears to have remained in the civil domain. Property claims, perhaps defamation, the kinds of legal instruments available to someone whose reputation had been publicly damaged, rather than producing a formal criminal witchcraft prosecution. This pattern was not unusual for New Hampshire witchcraft accusations of the period. The province had inherited Massachusetts statutes, but was developing its own judicial character, and the threshold for moving from accusation to capital prosecution was in most cases outside the specific crisis of 1692, high enough that many accusations resolved through other means. Community pressure, social ostracism, civil litigation, the gradual quiet settling of a situation that had no clean legal resolution but eventually stopped producing active conflict in the public record. The contrast with Salem a decade later is worth noting, though it should not be overstated. The Salem prosecutions of 1692 operated under conditions that New Hampshire in 1682 did not share. A community in the grip of acute social and political crisis, a specific set of judicial officials who accepted spectral evidence as sufficient grounds for conviction, and an escalating dynamic that fed on its own momentum in ways that the Walton-Jones case never approached. Hannah Jones was not tried. She was not executed. The accusation against her was serious, and the community's reading of her as the cause of Walton's troubles was presumably real, not polite skepticism wearing the costume of supernatural accusation, but genuine belief in a genuine framework, and yet the apparatus of capital prosecution was never set fully in motion against her. The case moved through the community and subsided, leaving behind a property dispute that remained unresolved, a pamphlet that eventually reached London, and a record that does not tell us what Hannah Jones thought or felt about any of it. That silence in the record is one of its most persistent qualities. The figures who appear most clearly in the documentation of the Walton haunting are George Walton, whose property was the site of the disturbances and whose position as the injured party shaped the account, and Richard Chamberlain, whose pamphlet is the primary surviving document. Hannah Jones appears in that pamphlet as an initial, a suspected cause, a name thinly veiled by a convention of discretion that offered her almost no actual protection in a community where everyone knew who Jay was. What she said about the accusation, how she understood the property dispute, whether she had her own record of the conflict that has not survived. These things are not in the record. The documentation of the Walton haunting was produced by people who were not Hannah Jones, for purposes that did not include representing her perspective, and the result is a case in which the accused is legible primarily as a social function, the older contentious neighbor, the suspected witch, rather than as a person whose inner life has any archival weight. This is not an unusual condition in the historical record of colonial witchcraft accusations. Carol Carlson's work on the women accused of witchcraft in New England drew attention precisely to this asymmetry, the way the documentation was produced by those who made accusations, administered trials, or recorded observations, rather than by those who were accused, and to what that asymmetry costs the historical understanding of these cases. Hannah Jones exists in the record of the Walton haunting as a shape defined by other people's accounts of her, a figure whose community role in the dispute is documented and whose legal fate is partially traceable, but whose experience of being named as the stone-throwing devil's agent in a small community on a tidal island in the summer of 1682 is not recoverable from the sources that survive. What can be said is that she was a real person in a real dispute over a real piece of ground in a community that had a real and coherent framework for understanding inexplicable events as diabolically caused. The land dispute was not invented to justify the accusation. It preceded the accusation and gave the community's reading of the disturbances a specific direction, not just an evil spirit, but an evil spirit whose presence on the Walton property could be understood as the instrument of a particular neighbor's grievance. Whether Hannah Jones had any relationship to the stones, whether she threw any of them, knew who did, or had no connection to the physical phenomena whatsoever, is something the historical record does not establish. What it establishes is that the community, led by the framing Chamberlain's account provided, read the connection as real. The boundary line between the two properties, whatever form it took, whether a fence or a surveyed marker, or simply a disputed edge of cleared ground, was, by the summer of 1682, considerably more than a property line. It was the physical location of a conflict that had moved through civil dispute, community gossip, supernatural accusation, and printed documentation without finding resolution at any stage. The land sat there in the early summer light, ordinary and silent, the same soil that had generated years of legal and personal difficulty. It did not know it was disputed. It did not know that its contested edges had contributed to a case that would eventually be collected by Increase Mather, published in London under a sensational title, and analyzed by historians 3 centuries later. It was simply ground, specific, bounded, belonging to the island, and the people who claimed it were trying to live ordinary lives in a new and not yet fully settled colonial world. There is something in the social framework of colonial New England that allowed the move from property dispute to supernatural accusation to feel not like an escalation, but like a clarification, as though the accusation named what had always really been at stake, translating a civil grievance into the theological language in which the deepest categories of right and wrong were actually understood. John Demos described this quality of colonial witchcraft accusations as a kind of social grammar, not a departure from the ordinary logic of community life, but an extension of it into a register where ordinary logical tools were not sufficient. The legal system could adjudicate a property claim. It could not adjudicate a grievance that felt, to the people involved, as though it had a moral dimension that property law did not reach. The witchcraft accusation provided language for that moral dimension. It was the community's way of saying that what had happened between Walton and Jones was not merely a civil dispute, but a wrong of a different kind, and in doing so, it raised the stakes for everyone involved to a height that the civil courts had never approached. The months that followed the initial disturbances in June of 1682 would have been, for the community of Newcastle, a sustained period of uncertainty. The stones continued, by Chamberlain's account for several months, intermittently, with gaps of quiet between incidents, and that duration meant that the disturbances were not a single event to be interpreted and moved past, but an ongoing presence in the life of the settlement. The community's reading of the cause would have been continually reinforced by each new incident, the name that everyone associated with the stones gaining weight with each recurrence. And Hannah Jones continued to live on Great Island, continued to share the lanes of a very small community with the people who had formed that opinion of her, continued to exist in close proximity to a situation in which she had no clear path to restoration. The accumulation of that kind of community judgment in a settlement the size of Newcastle was its own form of consequence, separate from any legal outcome, more pervasive in daily life than any court could produce or revoke. Whether or not Hannah Jones ever faced formal legal proceedings, she lived through the period in which she was publicly identified, through the thinnest of veils, as the cause of diabolical disturbance on a neighbor's property. The community that read Chamberlain's single initial as a name would have carried that reading into every ordinary interaction, every lane, every wharf, every gathering at Walton's tavern, and the weight of that collective reading, sustained over months, was a social fact as substantial as any recorded verdict. What the legal record preserved in the end was not a trial and not a conviction. The accusation against Hannah Jones appears to have resolved, if resolved is the right word for something that simply stopped generating active documentation without producing the formal criminal proceedings that the statute books of the period made technically available. The land dispute, which preceded the haunting and provided its social ground, does not appear to have been definitively resolved either. The stones eventually stopped. The community moved on, as small communities do, carrying the memory of what had happened without any particular mechanism for officially closing it. And the disputed ground between the two households remained the same disputed ground it had always been, bounded by whatever physical markers had always defined it. The question of rightful ownership, no more settled for the months of extraordinary events that had accompanied it. The scholars who have placed the Walton Jones case within the broader history of colonial New England witchcraft accusation, Boyer and Nissenbaum on the social kindling of economic conflict, Demos on the psychological and community dynamics of accusation, Carson on the gendered patterns of who was named and why, have each contributed something to the understanding of how a property dispute became a supernatural accusation and what that transformation meant. And each of them, in their own way, has also noted what the frameworks cannot fully contain: the specific texture of an individual case, the particular people involved, the specific community on a specific island in a specific summer, the details that fit the pattern and the details that don't quite fit, the ways that Hannah Jones and George Walton and Richard Chamberlain and the people of Newcastle were both instances of a general social pattern and something more particular than any general pattern accounts for. The land dispute was real. The stones were reported by multiple witnesses. The accusation was made in a community prepared to make it. The woman named was older, property involved, contentious, fitting the social template closely enough that the community's reading of her as the cause was, within the logic of its own framework, entirely coherent. And none of that resolves the questions the case continues to hold open. What actually happened in the nights of June and the months following? Who or what produced the stones? And what Hannah Jones understood of her own situation as the community around her settled into its interpretation, and the summer continued without answer. The record goes quiet on Hannah Jones without a criminal verdict, not acquitted in a formal proceeding, not convicted, not tried, simply absent from the kind of documentation that a trial would have produced, and present only in the form she had always occupied in the Walton account: a single printed initial on a page, a name transparent to every reader in Newcastle, a woman whose dispute with her neighbor had generated months of extraordinary events, and whose fate afterward the surviving archive does not clearly establish. The accusation did not conclude with her execution. It did not conclude with a formal vindication. It simply stopped producing documents that have survived to the present, leaving behind the shape of a conflict that found no clean resolution in the mechanisms available to it. The disputed land on Great Island is still there, in the sense that Great Island is still there. A small tidal island at the mouth of the Piscatum River, the same geography it occupied in 1682, the same water moving past the same low coastline. The specific property lines of the Walton and Jones holdings are long dissolved into the ordinary changes of 3.5 centuries. Whatever boundary line once marked the edge of the disputed ground has not survived in any form that would allow a person standing on Great Island today to locate it precisely. The land does not carry the record of the conflict in any way that is physically visible. It holds it only in the archive documents, the pamphlet, the court records that survive, the entries in Mather's compendium, and those documents record the conflict from the perspective of the people who produced them, which was not Hannah Jones. What the case leaves behind, as an open fact in the historical record, is the quiet of an accusation without a verdict. The stones stopped. The community moved forward. Hannah Jones was not tried and not executed, not vindicated formally, and not condemned by a court, simply allowed to continue existing in a community that had formed its opinion of her and had no mechanism to officially revise it. The disputed land stayed disputed, or resolved itself through means the record does not clearly show, or simply stopped mattering in the way it had mattered when the conflict was active. The island continued. The water continued. The case that had moved through civil dispute and supernatural accusation and printed pamphlet settled back into the ordinary life of a small colonial settlement, neither concluded nor entirely forgotten. The question of the land, somewhere still beneath the island's soil. 2 years after the stones stopped falling on Great Island, a book was printed in Boston. The year was 1684. The author was Increase Mather, the most influential theologian in New England, a man whose reading ranged across the full extent of what his century knew and suspected and feared. and whose institutional standing meant that what he chose to record in print carried the weight of the wider community's attention behind it. The book was called An Essay for the Recording of Illustrious Providences, and among the accounts it gathered, accounts of storms and drownings and strange lights, of voices heard at the edges of settlements, of objects moved without hands, was a passage about George Walton and the stones in Great Island. The Walton case had reached Boston. It had reached the desk of a man who was actively compiling the literature of New England's supernatural record, and he had found it worth the permanence of print. 2 years. The stones had barely settled into the soil when Mather set the account beside the others in his collection, and the specific events of a June night on the Piscataqua River became part of something longer and wider than a single household's difficulty. That absorption into a larger record is not a small thing. Mather's compendium was not a private notebook or a local pamphlet. It was a formally published book, available in Boston's bookselling trade, read by ministers and colonial officials and educated lay people throughout New England. And its inclusion of the Walton case meant that what had happened on Great Island was now part of the established archive of providential experience that New England's intellectual community was actively building. The compendium's full title gestures at the scope of the project. It was designed to record illustrious providences, meaning events understood as divine communications through natural and supernatural phenomena, the whole texture of a world in which God was believed to speak through visible signs. The Walton stone throwing fit this framework. The stones were presented not merely as a curiosity, but as a legible event, something worth preserving because it meant something, because it was the kind of occurrence that required a written record if the full weight of its significance was to be carried forward. What Mather understood about record-keeping was that events without documentation become legend, and legend becomes unreliable, and what a theological culture needed was not legend, but evidence. He was building, book by book, an evidentiary archive for a world he believed was full of the deliberate communications of divine and diabolical forces, and the stones on Great Island had earned their place in it. The Walton case had also not arrived at Mather's desk entirely without precedent. 3 years before the first stone struck the Walton property in 1679, while New Hampshire was still technically part of Massachusetts Bay Colony, a family in Newbury, Massachusetts, had experienced a disturbance that moved through a household with similar qualities. The family's name was Morse. The events that occurred in their home that year involved thrown objects, bodily disturbances to family members, and the kind of accumulating strangeness that communities in that period understood as having an intentional source, as something directed, not accidental, and therefore as something that implied an agent. What followed in the Morse case, as in the Walton case, was a witchcraft accusation. What followed the accusation was legal activity that did not resolve in a capital conviction. The shape of the Newbury events and the shape of what happened on Great Island 3 years later are different in their particulars, but recognizable as the same general category of reported experience, the same region, the same decade, the same structure of community response, the same movement from inexplicable disturbance to named suspect to inconclusive legal proceeding. The Walton episode, in other words, occurred within an already established and recurrent pattern. It was not singular. It was the second visible occurrence in a series. That continuity matters for what it reveals about the world. The Walton household inhabited, when the stones began falling on the night of June 11th, 1682, the people who witnessed them were not experiencing a phenomenon for which their culture had no category. They had categories. They had precedents. They had a developing literature of such events, assembled by men like Mather, circulating through the colony's reading public, organizing the experience of the inexplicable into frameworks that named it and assigned it meaning. The Morse haunting in Newberry had been discussed. The community knew what this kind of disturbance was called and what it implied about the person believed to be causing it. When Richard Chamberlain searched the Walton grounds during an active incident, holding his lantern out into the coastal dark and finding nothing that accounted for the stones, he was doing so within a culture that had already developed a systematic response to this category of event and had already produced the literature that would tell him how to write it down. The English precedent behind that literature was older still. In 1661, in Wiltshire, England, a property belonging to a man named John Mompesson became the site of a sustained disturbance that its community attributed to the malice of a traveling drummer whose drum Mompesson had confiscated. The disturbances in the Mompesson house involved repeated drumming sounds, thrown objects, physical disturbances to sleeping household members, and the kind of multi-month duration that made the events at the Walton property recognizable in comparison. A man named Joseph Glanville investigated the Mompesson case, visited the property, interviewed the household, and eventually published his account in a work called Sadducismus Triumphatus, a Latin title that translates roughly as Sadduceeism defeated, the Sadducees being the biblical sect famous for denying the existence of spirits or an afterlife, the title announcing the book's argument in a single phrase. Glanville's Sadducismus Triumphatus became one of the most widely read and debated works of supernatural documentation in the English-speaking world of the later 17th century. It established the form of the credentialed first-hand account. The educated witness who visits the site, investigates with whatever methods are available, and records the results with appropriate precision, as the genre through which such events would be preserved and argued over. When Chamberlain sat down to write Lithobolia 16 years after the events on Great Island, the template existed, the genre was established. Glanville had shown how a man of standing, willing to put his reputation behind a documented account of the inexplicable, could produce a text that demanded serious engagement rather than easy dismissal. Chamberlain followed a path that Glanville had made. Sadducismus Triumphatus was available in colonial New England. Books crossed the Atlantic in the holds of ships, in the personal luggage of ministers and officials and educated merchants, and the work of English natural philosophers and theologians was read in the colonies with the same interest, sometimes greater, that it received in London. Mather knew the work. The ministers and officials who discussed the Walton case in 1682 would have known it. The framework Glanville offered, the framework of the credentialed witness, the first-hand account, the careful documentation of physical evidence, was already present in the culture when the stones began. It did not create the experience, but it shaped the record the experience left behind. The record itself, as it stands today, is a document called Lithobolia, printed in London in 1698, approximately 16 years after the events on Great Island. The pamphlet is small. In its original form, it would have been cheaply produced. The kind of paper and binding associated with the pamphlet trade of the period, designed for wide circulation rather than long preservation. It carries a full declarative title in the typographic style of its century, announces its subject and its author's credentials in the title itself, and moves through Chamberlain's account with the blend of precise observation and interpretive argument that characterized the genre Glanville had established. The pamphlet survived. It was archived. It was eventually cataloged, preserved, and in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, digitized. The text of Lithobolia is available today in early American imprint collections, searchable and readable on screens anywhere in the world. Richard Chamberlain's account of what he witnessed on the Piscataqua, still intact and still open. A man sat down in 1698 to describe what he remembered of a June night in 1682, and what he wrote persists, unresolved, in a form he could not have anticipated, accessible to anyone who knows to look for it. The scholars who have looked for it have found a document that rewards careful reading precisely because it is not simple. Richard Godbeer's 1992 study, The Devil's Dominion, Magic and Religion in Early New England, placed the Walton case within the broader landscape of colonial supernatural practice. Reading Lithobolia as one piece of a larger pattern of magical belief and diabolical accusation that ran through New England's religious culture before, during, and after Salem. Godbeer's framework is attentive to what the document does not say, as well as what it says, to the silences in the record, the gaps between what Chamberlain recorded and what the community clearly believed, the spaces where the text allows inference but resists conclusion. The Walton case appears in broader scholarly treatments of colonial witchcraft as a case that illuminates the social machinery of accusation more clearly than many others, precisely because the legal record is sparse and the pamphlet record is rich, giving researchers an unusual angle of entry into the space between what happened in the community and what was eventually put into print. That space between event and print is where the interpretive work of later generations has had to operate, and the scholars who have worked there have brought different frameworks to bear on what they found. 3 distinct approaches have gathered enough sustained scholarly attention to be worth sitting with, not because any of them resolves the question of what happened on Great Island, but because each of them illuminates a different dimension of the case and of the wider category of experience it belongs to. One approach focuses on the psychological and parapsychological dimensions of the phenomenon. The term poltergeist, from the German words for noisy ghost, entered the formal language of psychical research in the 19th century as a category for accounts involving thrown or moved objects, physical disturbances to household members, and the accumulating, recurring pattern of inexplicable events that the Walton case exemplifies. William Roll, a parapsychological researcher who spent decades studying such cases, developed the theory of recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, abbreviated as RSPK, to account for reported poltergeist phenomena across the documented historical record. Roll's hypothesis proposed that certain individuals, typically in states of psychological stress, generate localized physical disturbances through a mechanism that current understanding cannot account for, and that these disturbances tend to cluster around them in ways that produce the recurring, moving patterns of activity that characterize poltergeist reports. Roll applied RSPK as an explanatory framework to historical cases as well as contemporary ones, and the Walton episode, with its months-long duration, its varying intensity, its apparent focus on specific locations and objects, fits the pattern he identified across dozens of other documented accounts. Whether that framework explains the stones on Great Island or merely describes their shape from a different angle is a question the research has not resolved. Mainstream psychological research has taken a more skeptical approach to the same body of phenomena, emphasizing the role of fraud, misperception, and the social dynamics of group testimony in generating and sustaining poltergeist reports. From this perspective, what the Walton case offers is not evidence of a physical phenomena without known explanation, but a documented example of how communities under social stress, communities in which unresolvable conflicts and real grievances have built up pressure, generate stories of supernatural disturbance that serve specific social functions. The stones in this reading may have been thrown by human hands. The witnesses may have reported what they expected to see rather than what they saw. The accumulation of testimony may have created a self-reinforcing narrative in which each new incident confirmed and amplified the previous ones, the community's interpretation shaping the community's perception until the two became indistinguishable. This framework does not require that Chamberlain was lying or that the Walton household was deliberately deceiving anyone. It allows for sincere misperception and genuine social pressure while maintaining that the physical events likely had a human source. What it cannot fully account for is Chamberlain's own careful investigative behavior, his attempts to search the grounds during active incidents, his use of marked stones as an evidentiary test, which suggests a man trying seriously to rule out human causes before accepting supernatural ones. The third framework focuses not on the physical or psychological mechanics of what may have happened, but on the social function the episode served within the community of Newcastle. This approach developed across the scholarship of historians including John Demos, Carol Carlson, and Paul Boyer and Stephen Nissenbaum in their studies of colonial witchcraft. More broadly, it's the Walton haunting as a mechanism by which an unresolvable social conflict, the land dispute between Walton and his neighbor, was translated from the legal and civic register into the theological one. Land disputes in colonial New England were resolved, when they were resolved at all, through legal proceedings that were slow, expensive, and uncertain. A witchcraft accusation, by contrast, moved the conflict into a different arena entirely, one where community emotion and collective belief carried weight that the slow procedures of a new provincial court could not easily match, where the accused was not a difficult neighbor with a legal claim, but a servant of the devil, whose guilt was readable in the texture of the events themselves. This framework illuminates what the accusation against Hannah Jones accomplished within the community. It reframed the conflict, elevated the stakes, and gave George Walton's position the moral and theological high ground that the legal dispute had not reliably provided. It does not require that Walton consciously manufactured the haunting as a strategic move. The social dynamics of accusation are rarely that deliberate, but it does suggest that the accusation served his interests in ways that the community would have registered and responded to. All three frameworks, Rawls' RSPK, the psychological skeptical account, the social function reading, have genuine explanatory power for particular dimensions of the Walton case. None of them accounts for all of it. The RSPK theory explains the pattern of events, but not the mechanism. The fraud and misperception account explains the community response, but struggles with Chamberlain's investigative behavior. The social function reading explains why the accusation happened, but not what the stones were. The Walton case resists the explanatory reach of any single framework, not because it is uniquely intractable, but because the documented poltergeist record as a whole has that quality. The same category of events studied from different disciplinary angles produces different partial accounts that overlap without converging. This is not a failure of scholarship. It is a description of where the scholarship actually stands. What the scholarship has established is the shape of the case as a historical event independent of its ultimate explanation. A disturbance of some kind occurred at the Walton property on Great Island, beginning on the night of June 11th, 1682, and recurred intermittently over the months that followed. A credentialed witness recorded the events in a document that survives. The community of Newcastle understood the disturbance within the framework of witchcraft accusation and directed that accusation at an older neighbor with whom the household head had an active property dispute. The accused was not formally tried on capital charges and was not executed. The legal record of the case resolves an ambiguity. The pamphlet record of the case resolves in an argument. Chamberlain's own conviction, stated in print in 1698, that what he witnessed was diabolical in origin, that the reader is free to accept or set aside as they choose. The question of what actually caused the stones to fall was not resolved in 1682, and the passage of 3 centuries and the application of several serious scholarly frameworks have not resolved it since. There is something worth dwelling on in the specific fact of the pamphlet's arrival in London. Lithobolia was published in 1698. Salem had concluded in 1692. The executions at Salem, 19 men and women hanged, 1 man pressed to death, several more dead in custody, had taken place only 6 years before Chamberlain's pamphlet entered the London book trade. The intellectual and theological climate of the English-speaking world in 1698 was already beginning to process what Salem meant, already beginning to ask, in ways that would take decades to fully articulate, what the evidentiary standards for supernatural testimony should be, what a credible witness's account of the inexplicable was actually worth, and what the relationship between community belief and legal procedure ought to be when the charge was witchcraft. Chamberlain's pamphlet arrived into this climate. It arrived explicitly arguing for the reality of diabolical supernatural agency in the Walton case, at a moment when that argument was becoming harder to make without reference to Salem and to what Salem had cost, and to the question of what certainty about such things was actually worth. Whether Chamberlain was aware of the weight his pamphlet carried in that context, whether the 16-year gap between events and publication was shaped partly by the shadow of Salem, is something the document does not say. What it carries, unavoidably, is the layered pressure of the decade between the stones and the print. The Walton case persists in the scholarly record as what might be called an open case file, a documented episode that has been studied, referenced, and contextualized without being closed. It appears in Richard Godbeer's account of colonial magical practice. It appears in broader surveys of New England witchcraft that situate it within the decade of accusation that preceded Salem. It appears in parapsychological literature as an instance of the historical poltergeist record. It appears in archival digitization projects that have made Chamberlain's pamphlet searchable and readable in ways that the original print run could not have anticipated. The case does not resolve. It accumulates layers of context and interpretation added to the original record, each layer illuminating something and obscuring something else, the total picture growing richer and less certain in roughly equal measure. The physical place persists as well. Great Island still sits at the mouth of the Piscataqua River, where it opens toward the Atlantic. The tidal rhythms that shaped the daily life of the Walton household in 1682 continue to move past the island's shores, the water rising and falling with the same indifference to human events that it brought to the stones, the property disputes, and the printed arguments of the 17th century. The town of Newcastle exists as a modern community on the same tidal island, where a few hundred people once shared narrow lanes and common knowledge of their neighbors' quarrels. The specific compound, the tavern, the stout buildings, the livestock pens, the gate that bore the accumulated impact of a summer's worth of stones, is gone, replaced by centuries of ordinary change. But the geography that shaped it persists. The island's low profile visible from the open Atlantic, the Piscataqua wide and tidal at its back, the exposure to coastal weather that made the distinction between natural and unnatural disturbance, a live question for anyone trying to reason carefully about what they had heard in the dark. Standing at the edge of the Piscataqua on a quiet morning in the present, the water moving past in its long, slow reach toward the ocean, the island sitting low in the light. It is possible to hold the full shape of the Walton case in mind without needing to resolve it. The stones fell, or something fell that the community called stones. A man with institutional standing and a serious attention to evidentiary procedure wrote the events down. The account he produced survived 16 years of memory and made it into print, and then made it into archives, and then made it into the digital collections where it now waits, patient and unresolved, for whoever next decides to read it. A woman named Hannah Jones lived at the edge of this story, identified by a single initial in the pamphlet, her name transparent to the people who knew her, her innocence or guilt unestablished by any court that sat in judgment.